Hello, it's me again. I am recording to the cloud this time, so hopefully there won't be any problems with the recording. Today, we are getting into the Module 8 lecture, which is, oh wait, I'm not there yet. I'm not there yet. There we go. Looking at populations and communities. And this is a nice slide to start with because this is, I believe these are Asian carp in some of the rivers in, I forget if this is the Mississippi or Missouri or one of the other rivers in the Midwest, but it's an invasive species and their populations have gotten very, very big. And in fact, just riding a boat down the river is enough to get these fish to jump out and possibly hurt you if you're going fast enough. Yeah, so sometimes populations become very, very large, and that can sometimes have negative consequences for the other living organisms in that area. But this is really kind of the first of the ecology lectures, so that's kind of good. That's going to be the theme for the rest of the term. All right, so the big ideas we're going to try and cover in this module, I'll talk a little bit more about populations, do some review of what we did in lab, covering demographics and general population dynamics, and then maybe some finer points about how non-human populations might be distributed and what sorts of life histories other species have. And then we will get into community interactions, how different species interact within a biological community. And then what is the result of those interactions? How do the species involved with that respond to each other kind of on an evolutionary timeline? So that's a really interesting thing to think about and kind of ties back into that idea of adaptations and structures and functions and things like that. And then we'll talk a little bit about biodiversity, why diversity in the biological community is important. And then we'll also talk about how that changes over time in this process called succession. So. All right, so lots of fun stuff to talk about today, or at least fun for me, and let's get into it. All right, so if you remember from our discussions, a population is all of the individuals of one species living in a particular area. The biological community is the next level up, and that's all of the populations of all of the species living in a particular area. And then an ecosystem is a little bit more than that because it adds the non-living environment, also known as abiotic environment. So these are kind of successive steps towards the bigger and bigger scales of measurement, or scales of study, I should say, that we're encountering this term. And so we'll kind of work our way, we'll start with populations, work up to communities, and then module 9, we'll talk more about ecosystems and the biosphere. And then the last module is looking at human effects and conservation. So, all right. So as you hopefully remember from lab, there are two basic models for population growth. The pattern where there's kind of a constant growth rate that doesn't depend on the size of the population, we would get exponential growth if that growth rate is positive. If the population is shrinking at a constant rate, then we'd get exponential decay, which is, would look like a little bit different, but really exponential growth is one that we have to be, I don't know that worried is the right word, but aware of. There we go. It's going to happen if there's enough resources and if all of those density dependent limiting factors can be kept at bay, then a population will experience exponential growth. And then The model where the growth rate changes as the population density increases, that would be called logistic growth. And so it starts out kind of on this exponential trajectory, but then over time that growth rate slows until the population reaches the carrying capacity, which is the biggest population an environment or an ecosystem can sustain indefinitely. All right, and then we talked about the density independent limiting factors, things like storms or geological events or astronomical calamities, the things that don't become more likely the larger the population is. For some of these, we could think about the human population and say, oh yeah, well, when humans get, when our population density gets high, we live in places where things like storms or volcanism could happen more easily. Okay, sure, but that's maybe a limited example for humans. Other organisms generally don't choose their habitats quite as carefully. Well, actually, I don't know, is that true? Yeah, actually, I would say that humans have an ability to think about where they make their habitats and could avoid some of these density independent limiting factors. We'll put it that way. But often we choose not to. We choose to do the opposite. So, okay, for density dependent limiting factors, those are things like competition for resources like food, nesting sites, things like that. Could be diseases, could be parasites and predators, could be a buildup of waste products. All of these things are going to cause higher mortality or lower reproduction the larger the population is. So that's why they are called density dependent. Okay, so some things we didn't talk about in the lab. Well, how are these populations distributed? Well, the short answer is they can be distributed in different ways. They could be a random distribution like we would see with dandelions or other wildflowers, that just wherever those seeds happen to land, that's where the individuals are going to be. And this tends to be true for species that don't compete with themselves very much. So intraspecific competition is low. And then also for species that can distribute or can disperse pretty easily. So that tends to lead to a random distribution. And basically it's those organisms aren't really interacting with each other, right? They don't get a benefit from being close together and huddled up, and they don't get repulsed by competition away from each other. So that's one pattern. A different pattern might be like this herd of elephants here. Their populations tend to be clumped. They have their usual stomping grounds, and they travel in herds. So they stick together for protection and for mutual benefit for the individuals in that species. And so that might be a clump distribution. Another way we could get a clump distribution is if plants, I'm thinking about mostly like acorns, right? The acorn doesn't fall far from the tree. So, new oak trees aren't going to be very far from the parental oak trees. And as a result, we could end up with these clump distributions that way. And then the last pattern is kind of a uniform distribution where there's kind of an equal distance between each individual, right? And that tends to happen when there is, when there's territorial behaviors that cause this. So competition for resources and maybe some displays or vocalizations that say, hey, this is my spot, you go find your own spot. or this uniform distribution, those are individuals that really need their personal space, like these penguins here. Okay, but again, we could find some other examples of that. Okay, so we talked about age structures for different countries, but I wanted to show you the age structure for the world as a whole, and this is current as of a couple of years ago. We are now over 8 billion, so this needs updating, but I think this website is dead now, so I'm not going to do that just right now. But here's the overall pattern. So as we can see, it's maybe not stable, right? The sides of the pre-reproductive age classes and the reproductive age classes aren't exactly even, right? Or close to even. But it's not that steep, that really steep pyramid that we see from some of the most rapidly growing countries. So it's somewhere in between, but it is a growing population worldwide. And so this is certainly cause for concern, along with how are these people using resources, these 8 billion people? How are we using resources, and how are we treating each other, really? So those are some good questions to think about. And obviously, there's going to be tons of variation in terms of family size and social norms and things like that. But the big picture is we do need to think about our population size as humans, because we rely on living systems to sustain us. And if our population gets too big, if we exceed our carrying capacity, that's going to be bad news, not only for the ecosystems, but also for us, because we're part of those ecosystems. Okay, the other thing to think about with these population statistics is you can create a life table, which is basically for any age class, what's the chance of dying or surviving to the next age class, right? So you can do this in a really fine-grained way, like 0 to 1, 1 to 2, and so on. And the life insurance actuaries really love to obsess about these, and the retirement planning, Social Security and PERS and all that. They should really be paying attention to these to see, okay, well, what's the expectation for people's lifespan, given our current age structure, and then the chances of them surviving, and what's that future age structure going to look like. But there's something really interesting that shakes out of the life table data, and that is the survivorship curve. And basically, for the percent of the longest possible lifespan of an individual, what is the chance of surviving at each point in time? Or you could think of this as the number of individuals surviving over time. And there's 3 different types. We'll start with the humans, because that's probably what we're familiar with. There might be kind of high infant mortality, but basically, if you live to the age of 5 or maybe 10, chances are you're going to live several decades past that. And so mortality tends to be pretty low for most of the lifespan. And then it's only once you hit those post-reproductive years that mortality really starts to pick up and survivorship decreases. So that's a type 1 survivorship curve. Type 2 is birds. That's kind of a uniform mortality throughout the lifespan. So it doesn't matter if the young, adolescents, middle-aged, old birds, they die at about the same rate no matter what. So that's kind of a more of a straight line in these survivorship curves. And then a type 3 is affectionately, these are known as broadcast breeders, the organisms that produce lots and lots of offspring, and with the realization that not a lot of them are going to survive. So like trees, most of the seeds and seedlings of a tree are going to die, and very few will actually replace the parental tree. So very high early mortality, but once those trees can get established, then very low mortality after that. Some other examples of this might be like salmon. Salmon have, I think they've got like 2,000 eggs on average, maybe more, or maybe it's 10,000. I forget. It's thousands, right? And of those eggs, maybe half of them hatch and become fry, and then those fry are swimming around in the rivers and streams, and they're very susceptible to predators. So very few salmon actually make it to the ocean to become adults. And the ones that do, once they become an adult, then they become the big predator and everyone else has to watch out for them, except maybe like orcas or maybe sharks. But yeah, so anyway, and then there's pretty high survivorship at that point. So, okay, yeah. All right, so that's all I'm going to say about populations. And now we're going to get into biological communities. So the community is made up of multiple species, and they can interact in a variety of ways. So there's a few interactions that we will not be covering. So if we have species A versus species B, if they don't have a net positive or negative effect on either species, we would call that a neutralism. But really that could also just mean that they might be in the same place or roughly the same place, but they're not really interacting. So neutralism, a lot of ecologists like to say that this is just a lack of interactions. Then the other one is where one species kind of doesn't matter if the other species is there, but then another species is harmed. And that would be like an amensalism. An example of that, if you think about people stomping around on trails, maybe that's the wrong example. Maybe like people stomping on grass, right? Might harm the grass, but for humans, the grass could be there or it could not, and it wouldn't really affect our survival and reproduction. So, okay. But the ones we are going to cover, the ones in darker text, they run the gamut, right? And you've probably heard of most of these terms, but I'll go over each of them. So mutualism is where both species benefit. And we've got some examples of that coming up. Commensalism is where one species benefits, but then the other species isn't really helped or harmed. It really kind of doesn't matter for the other species, but one species is sure happy about that interaction. And then we have quite a few where one species is benefited at the expense of another. And these we would call predation or parasitism or herbivory. So those we'll talk more about. And then the last one, the everybody loses interaction is competition. So this interaction is one where both species are harmed because they aren't getting the resources they need to survive and reproduce. So this is a really interesting one, and there's maybe the strongest selection pressure, the most benefit to evolving away from this competition, because no one's winning that, right? So we'll get there. Okay, we're going to start with mutualisms. So there are some examples that you're probably familiar with. Bees and flowers, flowering plants, and all sorts of insects, and maybe a few other types of animals, but mostly insects. This is a clear mutualism. In most cases, I should say, the plants get their genes distributed. Plants can't move, so they either have to throw their pollen to the wind or let some insect carry it to another flower of the same species. So there's clearly a genetic benefit for the, and a reproductive benefit for the flowers. And then the insects are fed. The flowers produce sugars, uh, nectar that feeds them and allows them to thrive. And so it's kind of this trade where both the trading partners come out ahead versus if this interaction isn't present. So the amount of pollination that happens without insect pollinators is pretty low for flowering plants. Yeah. Another example, these are termites, and termites chew up wood, but it's funny because they don't have the enzymes to digest wood. So they actually host a bunch of protozoan symbionts. And I should put this up here as a word. We'll talk about it in lab too, but symbiosis. That just means living together, and it could be a mutualistic symbiosis, or it could be a parasitic symbiosis, or a commensalistic symbiosis. But in any case, there's a symbiosis between these unicellular eukaryotes in the termite gut and the termites. So those single-celled organisms can actually break down the wood, digest the cellulose. This tends to happen in oxygen-free environments more easily than not. And they release the sugars that the termites can use for their metabolic needs. In return, the termites supply them with wood, and they supply them with a space to live that is protected from predators. It's got the right biochemical conditions, maybe a little warmer than the surrounding areas. So both species are benefiting in this mutualistic symbiosis. Another example of a symbiosis is between the algae and the fungi that we see in lichens. And actually, the newest research says it's algae and fungi, and also yeasts are sometimes involved in these lichen mutualisms. So, okay. All right. Commensalism is an interaction where one organism benefits, but the other one really isn't harmed, it really isn't helped. So in some good examples of this, like birds that nest in trees, it's very advantageous for the birds, up off the ground, away from predators, or a lot of predators. So that provides a huge benefit for the bird, but the tree, it's not really harming the photosynthesis, it's not really breaking branches, it's just kind of sitting there. So the tree isn't really helped nor harmed, or maybe the amount of branch breaking that happens because of nests that are too large, maybe that's compensated for by the birds leaving some fertilizer right at the roots of that tree. So, there might be some trade-offs like that, but overall, there's no net gain or harm to the tree. Some other examples are mosses and lichens and ferns that, again, if they can colonize a tree trunk or a branch, that's going to be very advantageous for them, but then the tree really isn't helped or harmed. It's not really taken away from that tree's ability to live. So in the last example, this could be argued multiple ways, but the clownfish, also known as the anemone fish or Nemo, for those pop culture fans, they get a lot of benefit from hanging out in these sea anemones that have these stinging cells. It deters predators. They rub around in these sea anemones and take in these stinging cells, and so they become toxic and distasteful for predators. So they benefit a lot. The anemones don't get a whole lot of benefit. Maybe they're getting some of the scraps of the clownfish. Maybe they're getting some advertising from the clownfish to say, hey, don't come here. This is a really brightly colored thing that might hurt you. Maybe they're getting fertilizer for the plankton that they feed on. But this is kind of an interesting one, but I'd probably put it in the commensalism rather than a mutualism. So the benefit to the anemones is not clear. We'll put it that way. Okay. So the next interaction is also a symbiosis, but this is one where one species benefits at the expense of another. I think I might have mentioned in the photosynthesis lecture, this plant called ghost pipe. It is a parasitic plant that saps nutrients from the roots of trees. And so it doesn't actually photosynthesize, it's just parasitizing other plants and using their photosynthesis to supply its nutrients. So they are helped, the other organism is harmed. Another example of parasitism, tapeworm infections, which could be in humans or in livestock. And they kind of take up residence in our intestines and siphon off a lot of the nutrients. And they don't have to do any of the work of capturing or harvesting food items, and they just kind of sit there and they don't have to even produce digestive enzymes. They can just sit there and absorb nutrients off their host. And then lastly, some of my favorite parasites are parasitic wasps that parasitize caterpillars. And the larvae of these wasps grow inside the caterpillar. And eventually they get to, maturity. Well, not maturity. They get to the stage where they need to pupate, and they will bust out and form pupas on the caterpillar host. And a lot of times they will kill the host when they do this. And there can actually even be, what do they call them? Hyperparasites, where the parasites get parasites. And those wasps can figure out which caterpillar has already been parasitized, and they'll find that and then lay their eggs inside the parasite that's inside the caterpillar. So it's kind of like this turducken of parasitism. Pretty cool stuff. Well, it's pretty terrible stuff if you're the caterpillar, but it's really interesting stuff, I guess, for us entomology aficionados. Okay, herbivory. That's an obvious one. Animals eating plants is basically herbivory. Trying to think of non-animal examples. Maybe you might have some single-celled organisms that eat other single-celled algae, and you could maybe call that herbivory, but usually we're talking about terrestrial organisms, and usually those primary consumers, the first level consumers that have to eat something else. They can't just photosynthesize. So those are herbivores. Okay, predation, predators and prey. So like this snowshoe hare and the lynx that's chasing it. Usually the bigger animal eats the little one, and that is predation, right? So you've probably seen tons of examples, lots of nature documentaries about this. Something interesting can really, sometimes in certain cases, we can get this population cycling where the population of prey start to increase exponentially. And then because of that, the predators now have a lot of food. So their population starts to increase exponentially. Well, then pretty soon there's so many predators that they start eating a lot of the prey population kind of declines, and then the predator population declines, And then the prey population can increase again, and then the predator population. So it's kind of these linked cycles that are offset by a certain time frame that we can sometimes see, especially if those predators are specialists, if they prefer to eat particular prey items. So, okay. All right. Well, obviously, herbivores and predators, it's not good for the species being harmed. So there are some evolutionary responses to this. The first of those is size. If you can become big enough, you're basically immune from predation or herbivory, or at least, you know, mammal herbivory. No, I don't want to say mammal. I'm mostly thinking like a tree. If it grows tall enough, big enough, it's, you know, it's less likely to have a lot of herbivore damage. And for predators, obviously, you know, elephants don't really have any natural predators, for the adult elephants, I should say. So rhinoceroses, same sort of deal. And if we go back to like dinosaur times, the largest organisms were these giant herbivores that they were really bigger than the predators. So the predators are probably not going to be trying to take them down. Speed. If we think about cheetahs and gazelles on the savannas of Africa, you know, obviously if the gazelle evolves to be a little bit quicker, the cheetah is going to evolve so it's a little bit quicker. And there's kind of this back and forth coevolution and this kind of speed race over the course of evolutionary history. Behavior. And a good example of behaviors that deter predators, well, you could think about like a skunk spraying, although maybe that's maybe a different example, or like a cat. If you've seen a cat get spooked, it'll arch its back and fluff up its tail, make itself look as big as possible. So that's a change in behavior that could potentially deter certain predators. Physical defenses, and I've got a couple of examples of this on the next slide, so I'm not going to say too much more about that. There are chemical defenses. So the skunk might go along with that one as well. That noxious skunk spray smell, that's a chemical that the skunk produces to deter would-be predators. And oftentimes there's a color palette that says, hey, I've got chemical defenses, don't mess with me. So that's kind of a signal to predators, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. There's mimicry. Maybe you don't have chemical defenses, but maybe you want to pretend like you do. So there's different kinds of mimicry that take advantage of that. And then another defense could be camouflage, also called cryptic coloration, so blending in to the environment so that you don't get noticed. Okay, some defenses against herbivores. Here on the left, we have some physical defenses. I believe these are acacia thorns, which are not pleasant for herbivores trying to eat this plant, or actually even kind of hang out near this plant. So those are going to deter certain herbivores for sure. Another example, this foxglove plant produces a chemical called digoxin and digitoxin, actually two different types of compounds that are very, very closely related in terms of their chemical structure. These are known as cardiac glycosides, which are very, very toxic. Their only job is to be toxic to any would-be herbivore. And it's kind of interesting because this toxin actually changes the sodium and calcium concentrations inside the cells. And it causes changes to the cardiovascular system. So the heart rate decreases, but the force of each contraction increases. And basically the individual goes into heart failure if the dose is high enough. Although doctors have figured out, well, maybe there's, for certain heart conditions, there's a range of digitoxin concentration that is actually therapeutic. So that's kind of interesting. But anyway, this is just one of many examples of chemical defenses in nature. Okay, here we see some camouflage, some cryptic coloration, like trying to look like a leaf here, kind of green coloration, or trying to look like a stick. So there's lots of cool examples of this, especially in the insect world. So there are certain bugs that look like thorns, others look like leaves. There are some that mimic other species. So yeah, lots of cool examples of evolution to be found. All right, anyway, never mind. So we were talking about warning coloration, also sometimes called aposematic coloration. And these are, when we want to get people's attention, we use a certain color palette, right? So taxi cabs, the yellow and black and white, or black and red, or all of the above, if you're an 80s rock star. Yeah, so the reason we use this color palette is because it has this innate programming. Most organisms are tuned into these colors, these high contrast, or for those organisms that can see in color, the yellows and the reds. And basically it says, hey, I'm here, watch out, right? So some other examples of that, like yellow jackets, bees, because they sting, right? Skunks because they can spray. This would not be a frog that I would want to lick. This is almost certainly toxic. And this angelfish here, again, almost certainly toxic. I don't know if that's technically an angelfish, but it kind of looks similar. But anyway, so yes, so lots of examples where the organisms produce toxins or venoms and advertise conspicuously so that we know not to mess with them. Okay. Well, it turns out advertising is useful, right? And sometimes false advertising is useful. Sometimes there are mimics where so here we have a yellow jacket, right? And here we have, this I think is actually a syrphid fly. They actually are predators, but they aren't venomous. They can't sting a mammal and cause great pain. So here the model organism is toxic or venomous, and the mimic is palatable. It could be eaten, it's just not because it's got this color pattern, right? So this is called Batesian mimicry. And a long time ago, it was thought that, well, all these, all sorts of mimicry were kind of fakers, right? Where one is palatable and the other one is not, and then there has to be a certain ratio. It's got to be more of the harmful or toxic ones than the palatable ones out in the wild, and so that's one idea. Another idea about mimicry is, well, wait a minute, what if all of the species are toxic or venomous to some extent? And here are some examples of butterflies. I want to say Heliconius butterflies or Heliconia species from the tropics, but basically they've all got these orange and black patterns, or orange or black and yellow. All of these look like they shouldn't be eaten. And it turns out all of them are toxic. They're different species, but kind of related species, but they all have different toxins in them. So Müllerian mimicry is a case where both, there is no model and mimic, right? They're all kind of toxic and they mimic each other, and the messaging that they provide, if a predator eats one of these and gets really sick, it's going to say, okay, I'm not going to mess with anything that looks remotely like that. So this one, none of them. I'm going to avoid them all. So that is probably more the case. And actually the classic case of mimicry, the butterflies, the monarch and the viceroy butterflies, that's actually a lot of times a case of Müllerian mimicry, because it depends on what those caterpillars are eating for the monarchs and the viceroys. And a lot of times the viceroy caterpillars actually are eating toxic plants and keeping those toxins in their bodies. So anyhow, yeah, mimicry is cool stuff. And I'm happy because I get to talk about bugs. All right, competition. So what do organisms and species compete for? Well, we could come up with a huge list here. Food, shelter, water, nutrients, light. Yeah, what else? If we're talking about a single species, mates, right? Or territories. But if we're talking about community interactions, we're talking about interspecific competition, which is between species competition. So let's see, did I get them all? I think so, yeah. So that's kind of the laundry list. There might be some other things that are less common, but this covers most of the resources that organisms or species could compete for. Well, remember that competition is an interaction where both species are harmed. So there's a lot of selection pressure to avoid competition. To give you an example, these are some graphs of populations of Paramecium. There's two different species. There's Paramecium aurelia and Paramecium caudatum. And growing on their own, we see that typical logistic growth pattern, right? Kind of exponential to start, and then it tapers off and reaches a carrying capacity. Well, what happens when we put them together? Well, one of them actually does better than the other. One of them is the better competitor. Paramecium aurelia can outcompete the other Paramecium when you put them in a little tiny culture jar. After a while, you don't see any of the Paramecium caudatum. You see a lot of the Paramecium aurelia. And this is a concept known as competitive exclusion. So one of the species has excluded the other from the community. Okay, so competition is going to occur anytime that the niche of an organism overlaps, or the niches of two different species, I should say, overlap. Put that in there. We'll say niches to indicate that there's two species, right? And a niche, what's that? Well, it's like the place of an organism. It's all the requirements for an organism in terms of temperature and humidity or salinity or pH or suitable habitats, holes of a very specific size for like birds that nest in trees. And there's a lot of things that could go into defining a niche, almost limitless. We could think of different variables that define a niche, but these niches aren't completely unique to a given species. Sometimes they might overlap. And whenever niches overlap, you're going to get competition, and there's the possibility of competitive exclusion, especially if one organism's niche is much bigger and encompasses the niche of another species. Like those Asian carp that we saw on the first slide, they are outcompeting a lot of the other fish in those waterways because they're better competitors. They can tolerate a wider set of conditions than the native species could. So, okay. So this is a problem for species, for all species, and even the winner of competition loses in that competition, right? It's a lose-lose game. It's a lose-lose interaction. How do you win? The big idea is resource partitioning. If you split up the habitat and specialize in a particular subset of that habitat, then you can coexist with other species without this competitive interaction. So it actually benefits both species to kind of narrow their niches to avoid this competition. And this happens all the time in nature. There's a nice video here that I'm not going to show you right now. Oh, it's going to try and play. I'm not going to show you it. I'll put it in the link immediately below this video. I'll put it as an optional, so if you have time, you can watch it, but it's kind of cool about how woodpeckers partition their niches and then what happens in environments where you don't have woodpeckers. So, okay. All right. Another facet of communities is the diversity of those communities. How many species are present? And also how those species are distributed. But basically the big pattern in biodiversity is that it's concentrated near the tropics. So the areas around the equator tend to have many more species than the more temperate or Arctic areas. Biodiversity is generally a good thing. Why is biodiversity important? Well, we'll get into that. For starters, we can have species that are foundational to an ecosystem, to the community and the ecosystem. So, for example, coral reefs, the defining species are the corals, right? Without the corals, we can't have the fish and invertebrates and all the other species that call a coral reef home. Without the reef, it's not a home, right? Or that's kind of like having a forest without trees. You just can't do it. So some species are kind of foundational for different community types. Another example is of the importance of biodiversity. Sometimes we have keystone species, which aren't particularly aren't particularly common in a community, but then they can regulate the structure of the community by their activities. And a good example of this is sea stars. Predation from sea stars actually keeps the intertidal species in check, and they prevent competitive exclusion from happening because the population never gets big enough to compete. And there's a great video on sea stars and the discovery of this idea of keystone species. Again, I'm not going to show this video now, but there's this video and then another one about some different keystone species. So I'll put those in the links. I'll put some links right below this if you're interested. Oh, there we go. Okay. So the last thing we're going to talk about is community dynamics, and the change in the community composition over time is really interesting. This process is called succession. So kind of like political succession, where one party gives way to a different party. Biological succession or ecological succession is where the composition of the biological community changes over time. And it usually starts with so-called pioneer species, which are very quick to grow, quick to reproduce, and quick to disperse. We tend to call these, the technical term is R-selected species. So their strategy is reproduction and spreading to new habitats. And over time, those pioneer species get replaced by so-called K-selected species. And these are species that are slower to grow, slower to reproduce, slower to spread, but they can compete, right? They can outcompete these pioneer species. So some examples of that in this oak and hickory forest. If you have a bare plot of land bordering an oak and hickory forest, the first species in there are usually probably annual plants, like herbs that are kind of weedy, right? That kind of just show up and all of a sudden there's a lot of them and then the next year they're gone, right? So those are the pioneers. And then as those species die and decay, it starts to build the soil to be a little bit better, right? And then those pioneer species are succeeded by grasses and perennial plants, ones that stick around maybe a little longer and have a little more hold on those nutrients. Then those get replaced by the intermediate species, shrubs, pines, young oak and hickory trees, but those young oak and hickories, they're still kind of having to compete a little bit with the intermediate species, and maybe they don't grow quite as fast, but they grow slowly, and over time, they will become the climax community of oak and hickory. And those trees can outcompete for resources. They get the light, they kind of shade every other species out, and that's the end point of succession, is this climax community that doesn't change until there's some sort of disturbance, like a fire or a windstorm or an ice storm or whatever the disturbance happens to be. Okay, so there are two different types of succession. So-called primary succession happens when there was no pre-existing biological community. And so we can see this like in the Hawaiian Islands. That's like new land popping out from the ocean. And these volcanoes are basically producing bare rock that's totally sterile. No community is present when it first starts. And then over time, we can have those pioneer species start to come in, and then they get replaced and so on. And you can actually, you don't have to go to Hawaii to see this. You can actually go to the Long Beach Peninsula. A lot of the sediments that are eroding from the Cascade Mountains end up in the Columbia River, and then that ends up on the Long Beach Peninsula. And the dune on that beach is actually growing. A lot of places coastal erosion is happening, but this is a place where the dune is actually expanding. There's new sand that keeps accumulating because there's just so much of it coming out of the Columbia, and the way the currents and eddy currents work just happens. So the first species there are these dune grasses, right? And maybe a few other types of plants. And they have to be very hardy because there really aren't many nutrients there to begin with. And as they start to die, this is kind of the, the heyday of the of the dune grasses. Heyday, I should stop. But as they start to die, it starts to develop the soil, and it becomes more soil-like and less sandy, right, and less salty. And then we might start to get some shrubs and some pine trees coming in. Sorry about that. I sometimes get interrupted here. So anyway, we were talking about primary succession up at the Long Beach Peninsula. Yes, after the dune grasses die off and make some nice fertilizer, the shrubs and shore pines can come in. And then over time, those shore pines give way to more shrubby, different shrubs, leafy shrubs, and maybe, I think eventually kind of a Douglas fir, maybe spruce and red cedar and hemlock type forest. So, okay, so that's primary succession. A different kind of succession is called secondary succession, and that is where there's a pre-existing biological community and there's a fairly severe disturbance which knocks the whole process of succession back to an earlier stage. It doesn't completely sterilize. We aren't starting from bare ground for terrestrial examples of this succession, but we are starting with a vastly different community. And an example of this might be a clear cut or a moderate intensity forest fire where some of the organisms have died, but not all of them, right? So that's going to change the community structure, and generally those earlier successional species, the pioneer species and some of the intermediate species, they can come and colonize and start the process again, but it isn't starting from scratch. So, okay. So the last thing we'll talk about with these community dynamics, which is really kind of the interesting stuff that my thesis work was about, is asking, is there a link between biodiversity and community stability? Because ideally we'd want stable, resilient biological communities that can handle some disturbances and still function, you know, at a level that at least can sustain people, if not sustain other species, right? So there's a lot of mixed evidence for this idea, the relationship between biodiversity and stability. We know that monocultures encourage pest outbreaks. So whenever we plant a single species of crop or single species of tree, that can sometimes lead to pest outbreaks. Just because, you know, hey, there's this buffet of food for any specialist herbivore to take advantage of. That said, I should say that sometimes we have a diverse community and an invasive species is introduced, and it can destabilize that community because of that competitive exclusion we talked about. So again, if we use that, the example of the Asian carp or English ivy, or name your invasive species, right? There's an example of how it's harmed the structure and functioning of existing communities and made them less diverse. So sometimes, you know, sometimes when we see a less diverse community, we can say, oh, it's, you know, that there might be this positive correlation between, like, we just add one species, but then the result of that is ending up with fewer species. Maybe is how I want to put that. Okay, and then another way that can shake out is with climax communities. So that endpoint of succession, those communities are actually less diverse than the transitional communities. Those transitional communities might have some intermediate species and some climax species all mixed together. But then over time, those climax species outcompete the others. So really the endpoint of succession is a stable community that is actually a little bit less diverse. So all that is to say that, well, it's hard to say. But there's a really interesting idea that kind of comes out of all of this, and it's called the intermediate disturbance hypothesis. And basically this says that some moderate level of disturbance can actually invigorate a community. It can prevent competitive exclusion. And so actually having a low level of disturbance can be helpful. So actually, like the grazing of large mammals on the prairies, that actually prevents those grasses from competing with each other. And if we remove those large mammals, we can end up with less diverse communities that are maybe less stable. Another example of this is the sea stars that are structuring the communities in the intertidal, the rocky intertidal habitats on the coast. You remove the sea stars and suddenly the mussels can outcompete everything else. And so you don't have the urchins or the anemones or anything else, right? It just becomes all mussels. Or another good example of this is low intensity forest fires. So these so-called prescribed burns where they deliberately introduce fire to kind of prevent competition, prevent water stress, because these organisms are competing so hard with each other. By clearing some of that vegetation out, knocking the populations back a little bit so they don't become so large that they really, really start competing and harming multiple species, right? That can actually make the whole community more stable and more resilient. So it's a really interesting idea. And we see it being implemented in terms of, restoring ecosystems. Sometimes we have to find that keystone species or that key disturbance to make the community function in a more, I don't want to say better, right? Better is maybe, but a more more integrated, more connected way. So we'll put it that way. All right, I think that's all I have. I'm going to stop recording and then edit this video, edit out all the interruptions, hopefully, and we'll see you next time.